Hello, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Valerie Laxton. I'm a senior associate at the World Resources Institute's Finance Center. I'm here to welcome you to this webinar. This webinar is co-hosted by the World Resources Institute, or WRI, and the European Investment Bank, or the EIB. Decision makers, economic and financial leaders from all countries are gathering this week in Washington, DC for the annual meetings of the World Bank Group and the International Monetary Fund, both multilateral institutions. A number of global challenges will be discussed. Think the pandemic and its consequences in countries, heightened uncertainty about the economic and financial outlook, inflation and debt developments, and the increasingly extreme impacts of climate change. Such global challenges require global solutions, and these solutions require financing. This is what we'll focus on today. We will consider how to deploy the full financial toolbox to deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement, set in 2015, the multilateral agreement that brought together all nations to undertake ambitious efforts to face climate change and help adapt to its effects. 7 years later, from different countries, calls are being made for the multilateral institutions to evolve, deliver, and lead as climate change impacts are felt acutely in the most vulnerable of communities and countries. From public to private institutions or entities, all sides can be further mobilized. Today is about how they can make changes happen fast and at scale. I'm inviting our audience online to please insert your questions in the chat box while our panelists are speaking, and we'll make sure to gather your questions and channel them to panelists in the Q&A part of this webinar. But first, to introduce this session and our speakers and panelists, I'm turning to Ani Dasgupta, President and CEO of the World Resources Institute.
Thanks, Valerie. Good morning from Washington, all of you who've joined. Thank you very much for joining. It's absolute distinct pleasure to co-host with you, with the EIB here. A distinct pleasure, Minister, to have you here. My name is Ani Dasgupta. If you're not familiar with WRI, I'm the CEO of WRI. WRI is a global research organization that is focused on finding solutions with partners, like partners right here, that intersection of climate, people, and nature. And our finance practice is directly connected with how do we actually make this transition transition to a low carbon, nature-friendly, people-centric economy. And our work has been focused on how the whole financial system works. And there's been a lot of discussion recently, and you'll hear more about the next weeks in the World Bank meetings. Is the finance something called climate finance gap? It's basically how much finance is needed for mitigation. For example, people have estimated, there are many different estimates, it's about $4 or $5 trillion a year, and how much is actually spent right now. And there is a big gap between those two numbers. Similarly on adaptation, the estimates right now is anywhere from $200 to $300 billion a year in 2030. Right now, the total expenditure or allocation for adaptation is around 45 billion, another big gap. So the discussion today is how do we get all our systems together to fill this gap? This gap won't be filled with any one organization or any one sector. We will need all sectors like MDBs, public finance, private finance, to come together in innovative ways to partner and figure out how we can actually fill this gap. Without filling this gap, this transition will not happen. And that is the big existential question of how do we do it. Today's discussion is exactly about how do we innovate, what partnership we need, how do we fill this gap. We have a distinct pleasure to have President Hoyer here, President of EIB. EIB has been a real champion, a leader among MDBs to think about new solution, new partnership. We'll hear about them. We also have the distinct pleasure to have Minister Rania al-Mashat, who is the Minister of International Cooperation for Arab Republic of Egypt. Hosting the COP is an exciting time. We're a few weeks from now, so we'd like to hear from you. What are your hopes about this? And finally, Ambroise Fayolle, the Vice President of EIB, who has oversight of financing of environment, climate issues. I had the pleasure of working with him at the World Bank, so it's a distinct pleasure to have you back at WRI. I think we want to start this discussion off with President Har setting the stage for us. I would welcome you to give us a keynote. And I think that's on. Yeah, you're good.
Thank you very much, Ani. It's a great pleasure and honor for Ambroise, Fayolle, and myself to be here at the WRI together with Mr. Werner al-Mashat, who has a great challenge ahead of herself over the next weeks and months. And she has been working on it like crazy. And I really appreciate your incredible energy and effort you put into a success of COP27. Thanks for the kind introduction and for hosting us today, Ani. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us. It is always a pleasure for my team and myself to exchange with like-minded climate warriors like you and Rania. We have been in meetings in various climate fora looking for the magic potion to tackle the climate crisis. But today we are meeting at an even more critical moment when the world is facing worsening, overlapping crises, climate, energy/food, pandemic, as Russia is weaponizing its energy supply, holding the world hostage, targeting the inner social fabric of our nations. However, the current energy crisis also presents an immediate opportunity for green transition. We must increase our climate ambition and accelerate investments in green energy to become energy independent and tackle the climate crisis simultaneously. And we have seen a series of powerful measures in the Repower EU package of the European Union, and recently in the past Inflation Reduction Act in the USA. Very impressive. At the European Investment Bank, we are supporting these initiatives. You probably have heard Secretary Yellen's call last week for MDBs, among other important topics, to step up our climate ambition, develop innovative financial instruments, mobilize private capital to accelerate the green transition in developing countries, and to support nascent and innovative clean technologies. These are exactly what EIB has been doing, and I have to add, we have been ahead of the curve. The EIB is the climate bank of the European Union, and we are the first and probably so far the only MDB who is fully Paris aligned since 2021. As we continue to deliver our goal of 1 trillion euros of green finance in this critical decade, we are deploying our full toolbox through our lending, blending, advising approach to help clients and partners to reach their net zero targets. We are not doing this despite the energy crisis, by the way, but in a certain way because of it. It must be clear that energy, security, and climate have to go hand in hand if we want to avoid a replay of the current predicament in the near future again. And for that, investments in energy efficiency, the scaling of renewable energy sources, and innovative energy technologies are key. As the present chair of the heads of MDBs this year, I'm happy to report MDBs have achieved important progress, notably in the joint Paris alignment work. We'll hear more at COP27, but there is no doubt that much more work needs to be done. COP27 is the implementation COP, as Rania al-Mashat always calls it, and she's right. So let's put all our hands on deck and get to work on tangible projects. We must walk the talk. Ladies and gentlemen, as we watch the roads and houses being washed away by floods in Pakistan and in Florida, I don't need to tell you that climate change is a global crisis and is real, whether or not you are a scientist. We need to act fast, we need to act together, and we need to act now before it is too late. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mahar, for setting up the stage. And I'm so pleased that you mentioned not only the transition, but just transition that needs to happen in every country we're talking about. So the question is not really how do we finance decarbonization, but how do we finance a transition of the economy that's not only good for carbon, but good for people and good for nature. So thank you very much for setting up. I'm going to go to both of you with a question, I think, in all of our mind, and give you a few minutes to take your time to answer, is that, we have had commitments. We have just heard MDBs on are all MDBs collectively doing. EIB, you're absolutely right, is ahead of the curve here in the commitment and Paris alignment, the commitment of private sector, the commitment of countries. So there are all these commitments there, yet we all know there is a big gap, right, in what needs to happen and what's happening. Love to hear from you, your perspective. But what are the critical barriers? What are the key challenges we should be looking at, or you look at, as you think about this finance issue? Minister, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here. And thank you, EIB, for co-hosting this with the Institute, and for the leadership of President Hoyer with the MDBs and Vice President, who has been actually at the implementation of projects that EIB is financing. So here we have institutions with vision, but implementation. So this is very important. And it's not, and I'm very happy that we're an institute that calls for investments in water, because this COP, in addition to being a COP from pledges to implementation, is also focusing on adaptation and resilience. And adaptation includes food security and includes water security. And I think what we've seen with events globally is that food security is important for all countries, not just for emerging and developing economies. Now, a few points on concessional finance and the commitments that we've had. The $100 billion for financial commitments, we are short of that. There are many calculations. I won't go over calculations, OECD and others, but we know that we are short of this. And just to give one example, if we take all Africa, the amount of money required for them to fulfill their NDCs per year is $250 billion. What has reached the continent is 19 billion. That is just one item, the NDCs themselves. And if we take the whole MDB world, they will only be able to fulfill 4% of what is needed in terms of climate action. And that's where the private sector comes in. But nonetheless, the innovation that is happening with respect to blended finance, with how concessional finance can actually crowd in private sector is quite important. The other important item, and this is what EIB has been doing as well, they have been engaged in countries in water treatment plants. So there has been beyond mitigation, which is very important for generating revenues for the private sector, but there have been examples where adaptation projects have been quite key and have generated private sector or public-private partnerships. So these are important points to highlight. I believe that when you say what are the impediments, the climate agenda is for all stakeholders together. President mentioned all hands on deck. Governments have a job to do. MDBs have a job to do, the private sector, and today philanthropy is coming in very forcefully as well, and we should not ignore that. We should actually try and see how we can create synergies with the objectives of financing that they have in mind. During Sharm el-Sheikh on November 9th, which is the Finance Day, we'll be launching the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing. EIB is a partner with us in this work, and it's an operational guide that says what each stakeholder needs to do to be able to overcome the impediments. So I believe that many things should be done by many stakeholders, but what is very, very important, and just to emphasize the point that was made, it's a very urgent time. Financing is required fast. There's no better time than now when climate is so urgent, and countries that are ready with projects that include climate and development, we should avail the financing into these projects so that people are benefit, and the private sector that could implement these projects could also benefit. So I believe that the work that is being done through the MDB group, and it's becoming very vivid now, is the innovative financing instruments that can crowd in private sector investments. One of the outcomes of Glasgow was the commitments not just coming from public money, but coming from the private sector. And the idea is how we can leverage together so that it makes its way to the countries that need it the most. I will conclude by an example that Egypt is putting together. It's a country platform. We are not a JETP country because we do not use coal. So we're not part of the G7 initiative, but we created our own country platform that includes mitigation projects and adaptation projects, and working with partners such as EIB. EIB has a very strong partnership with Egypt on different project wind farms, so mitigation is there. As I mentioned, water, on sustainable transport as well. So we are trying through this country platform to show that here are projects, real projects that could actually be presented to MDBs, to the private sector, think about innovative ways of finance so that we can go from pledges to implementation.
I'm going to come back to you about the country platform, which is absolutely fantastic. Vice President Fayolle.
Well, my life is made much easier because between what the president and the minister have said, you have your answer. And to be frank, I think if you want to define 4 families of what needs to be scaled up, the first one is the family of private sector financing, and here the public sector banks like EIB can help because we can have the right structures, we can have the right instruments, as the minister said, to try to make sure that private sector will come to finance projects. We will not reach targets without the private sector. The second thing is innovation. And actually, it's not only innovation in the financing ways, it's innovation to core, innovation per se. We will not reach the targets if we don't have innovation, and we know that already. And this is also where the public banks can help with philanthropy, actually, with some private sector sometimes, to make sure that we have the resources to do demonstration projects. And we do that a lot at EIB, especially on clean energy, on transportation. We do that also with the Gates Foundation, for example. The third thing is not to forget 2 things. One is that climate mitigation is important, but climate adaptation becomes more and more important. This is something probably we have a bit neglected. This is not in the DNA of some institutions. We are much more a bank financing big projects on renewable energy or energy efficiency. That is not necessarily adaptation. But we are moving in this direction because adaptation is recognizing that climate change is already there. And so now we need to ask ourselves, when we finance a project, is there something that could be related to adaptation? And the same thing is valid for, I would say, the just transition. The climate change, again, to be successful, we need to make sure that we don't leave, as they would say here, no one is left behind. Otherwise, you will have people having the feeling that, okay, this is already the same people who are paying the price of climate change. So we need to have a just transition. And indeed, the just transition is developed in COPs and in various Gs in the energy sector for some countries, but we need to do that also more globally. And the last thing that I would say is don't underestimate that climate mitigation or adaptation is very important, but this is also an environment challenge. And here, the concept of, COP27 is extremely important. Let's not forget COP15. COP15 on nature, on biodiversity. This is probably more difficult to measure, so more difficult to understand and more difficult to commit, but it is also certainly as important as the climate challenge.
Absolutely, on your last point, I mean, the science is clearly telling us without actually not only protecting and enhancing nature, there is no way to get to 1.5 degree. And I completely agree with you. That's less understood, I think. I mean, if you just look at the momentum for COP15 today versus momentum for Egypt, these are two distinctly different occasions. I do want to follow up with you, Vice President Fayolle, on the private sector point. You are absolutely right. If you just look at the numbers, whether you look at the 5 trillion or 4 trillion number, or the World Bank actually published, they said for Global South, it's $1 trillion per year that's needed. Whatever estimate you take, the most conservative, there is no way to fill that gap with public finances or MDB finances if you just add up everything that there is. So there is our estimate is about 700, even in the lowest, $700 billion. But today there is actually much more public-private finance in clean tech and in this than there was before. But even energy, which is actually have about $300 billion of finance last year, most of it is in global north. Most of it, 4% went to Africa of all that. Africa actually has the biggest solar potential in the world. So what, from our seeing, from where we sit, looking at the number, the private finance actually is not flowing yet. My question, you're a banker, you look at this every day. Is this just a moment of time that this will start flowing, or you see certain barriers to this happening in the scale that's needed?
Well, I think it will come because indeed there are great opportunities, and it has to be seen as opportunities in southern countries in terms of solar, but not only solar, hydrogen, for example, green hydrogen is also a great innovation that you will see in very interesting projects in Egypt, for example. But it needs to be supported. And this is also where we can, and we should be more active in terms of, project preparation, in terms of helping the teams in countries identify, putting in place the best regulatory environment, everything that can help also private investors to come to finance these projects. And we can help also in terms of finding the right structure for them to, for example, we have a fund of fund called MCAF, Emerging Market Climate Action Fund. This is a fund of funds, 500 million, great success together with Alliance to finance projects with a first loss piece that is taken by 2 European governments. So this kind of structure where we get a guarantee in combination with a first loss piece, that's the kind of thing that we need to do, but we need to do that much more. And for that, there is one thing that we are working on as multilateral development banks. This is what we call the long-term strategy facility that should help also the countries prepare their long-term decarbonization plans to be sure that what we do is consistent with these long-term plans.
First of all, I'm very happy to hear that you are positive about this. That's absolutely needed. And the structures you're putting in together on different EIB, but what MDBs are doing. Minister, if I can come to you with the most obvious question, I think our viewers is about COP, about your hopes for the COP, that what you think will be the collective ambition that you hope will be achieved in this. I specifically want to point out the 2 points you made about focus on adaptation in Africa. This is the Africa COP, and the focus on water that you already made. Because the water scarcity is one of the looming existential crises in most of sub-Saharan Africa. The maps we have developed of where people are going to live and where water crisis is, it's a very significant issue for all the regions. Share with us your thinking about how you see a successful COP and what you hope to see there.
A few points maybe to make. First, that compared to before Glasgow, the climate discussion was not mainstream as it is today. I think today schools are talking about it, families are talking about it, policymakers are talking about it. There's an increased awareness about this topic, and for countries that are sitting down to design their strategies going forward, green transition is a key word that is used in all 5-year plans with World Bank, African Development, EIB, and so forth. So it's becoming more entrenched than it used to be. It's no longer a conference or an afterthought, or maybe just activists talking about it. No, it's now dictating the financing structures that are taking place. Private sector has KPIs that they have to adhere to when they are taking loans from banks and so forth. So I think this is one I think very important outcome from Glasgow, and it has continued during the year. However, the global backdrop is more complicated than if we thought that COVID was a challenge and affected countries. Today, in addition to COVID, we have fuel prices, energy prices, and food, and there was another F that we just heard in a seminar before this, which is fragmentation, because the world is not seeing on all topics the same. So a few points that are positive about this COP is we are bringing water very much into the discussion. So on the first 2 days with the when the leaders are meeting, there's a roundtable for the first time on water security. So we're pushing the topics which are extremely timely and relevant for developing economies and for those who have not polluted but have been affected the most. So this is happening. Loss and damage is coming in more forcefully. You mentioned Africa during the Egypt International Cooperation Forum, which the Vice President attended in Cairo earlier September. There's a communique that came out of African Ministers of Finance, Environment, and Economy, which is their ask from the international community, including the innovative financing tools. What can we do with debt swaps, which are related to nature? It's coming in very forcefully now. And even though debt swaps are engagements between two countries, so it's a bilateral agreement at the end, but the multilateral system can provide measurement, can provide ideas of structures, we can leverage private sector engagement. So I think that despite the global backdrop, the success of COP, in my view, is giving more prominence to the issues, but in a practical manner. So this concept about implementation is a real one. We're providing real projects. So let's see if the money will make its way there. Philanthropy is present. How can they come in with the MDBs and come in with other private money to provide this initial seed money, the grant component that can de-risk and can actually help countries? Is this going to be an easy discussion? Not necessarily, but I think that what we've learned, I hope, despite the fragmentation, is that we learn from each other. In these 11 months, the amount of input that we've got from the different stakeholders on how to think about different financing tools, also countries coming to the different institutions with their views. I think this complementarity is very, very important to cherish and to try and push.
Can I just add two things to what Minister al-Mashat said? Because I think it's very important what she said about COP of implementation. I mean, I don't think what we need is new commitments at this stage, and new commitments that we are going to see later if we deliver or not. What we see is to show on the commitments that have been already taken, where are we? And are we on track or not? And that's going to be very, very important in the discussions in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the second thing is the minister said this is a COP that takes place in Africa. And for us also, Africa is a continent that is extremely important. And actually, you spoke about the importance of water and the water strategy. Well, I remember pretty well, Annie, when we work at the World Bank. This is not completely new that water has a geopolitical nature that is pretty strategic. We saw that already at the time in Central Asia, for example. Mm-hmm. What I find new is the way we try to, and rightly so, to include the water strategy in, for example, the urban strategy. Because in many countries, what's going to matter extremely importantly is how do you deal with cities tomorrow, especially in Africa. And that mixes transport, clean transport, water, wastewater, electricity policies. I mean, everything that is related to this that has to be seen together comprehensively if you want that these cities are cities where you can live. And so that's also why I find the prospect to come to Sharm el-Sheikh very, very interesting and promising.
If I can just react to one thing you said about your focus on water, as you said in the first 2 days, which we wholeheartedly welcome, because it's an existential issue, it's such a practical issue that existed before climate change became popular or topical, but it's absolutely connected to adaptation issues, food security issues, and Fayolle is absolutely right. This is not new, but what our data shows in sub-Saharan Africa and actually South Asia, India, these are two regions that have incredible problems with what's going to happen to urbanization, where people live in cities because cities demand more water, and what's going to happen in the hinterland. And that collaboration, as we're talking to EIB, for example. So very much welcome that. I do want to come back to you for a second on the private sector, because that is in Egypt what you're seeing, because you're seeing a lot of positive things. But before, I want to go back to our leadership in EIB, because you are now heading MDBs, right? You're championing this group of people, group of organizations that are critical as, let's say, as a catalyst to this mobilization of funds, not just what's in EIB, but also what's going to happen and encouraging this innovation that Fayolle talked about. This question to both of you, anyone can answer. Yet, love to hear where you think collectively MDBs are. I want to bring in the last few weeks, there's been criticism all the way from Secretary General about MDBs stepping up in this climate finance fight. Want to hear what your thoughts are. Is that criticism fair? You think MDBs are doing its part?
Well, I wouldn't call it a fair criticism, but I would say it's a welcome encouragement, because we try, as present chair of the MDBs, to get them together in an upward movement, and things are not that easy. You have to see that the different MDBs have totally different shareholderships and political constraints, and this is why we need to put a lot of effort and convincing power into these activities, but it is absolutely necessary. One needs to therefore also have a closer look at how we are going to address the relationship between the short-term political and social needs and the medium and long-term absolute necessities. So I do see that for somebody who wants to be elected next year, an extremely cold winter without any heating in your homes is not very wise from a political point of view. But therefore, we need to also, like the social, the fair transition, we need also to address these issues in order to get people on board. Because I'm convinced that there is no way around the energetic transformation, but we need to get people behind ourselves.
And you sorry, Phil, you wanted to answer.
No, maybe just to complement what the president said on MDB collaboration, because there is a lot happening behind the scene. And of course, no one pays attention, and that is completely fair. But you don't imagine the number of hours that MDB climate heads spent to make progress together as a group of MDBs. And you will see that in statements that will be presented in Sharm el-Sheikh. For example, we are going to make a climate finance tracking on adaptation. And this sounds not pretty attractive. This is not the most sexy announcement. This is very important because as long as you don't speak the same language, you cannot agree on what you need and if you are ahead or behind the curve. So this kind of thing, where we are in terms of implementation of the Paris Agreement for intermediated financing, for example. And these kind of things are pretty technical, but they are also very important. And this is where MDBs as a group collectively work and certainly can help. And hopefully we'll come to the long-term strategy facility. We will have a statement of MDBs about impact, these kind of things that also are contributing to the debate as MDBs. And in the meantime, we will certainly have the publication of the climate finance reports. That is a yearly exercise of the 10 MDBs, where you will also see that I'm not going to give any figure. I want to stay alive in Washington, but you will see that the figures are quite encouraging. But of course, that a lot remains to be done.
So, two thoughts. First of all, thank you for sharing that, both of you. I think having a comprehensive statement in Sharm el-Sheikh, we all look forward to. I mean, for all of us who work on this, especially me who is to work on the MDBs, MDBs is by far, if you look at the spectrum of capital in the world, it's the most thoughtful capital. Capital that is among the capital that can do the most with the capital it has. So we all absolutely look forward to it. Your last point on adaptation tracking, if that's a commitment we're making, it's just a coincidence our finance team guy is actually here. We're going to publish a blog today, I think, about the need for such tracking, because even the definition of what is adaptation finance is complicated. I'm not giving anything away because this thing will be published today. Our plea to that tracking would be to track private capital as well as over capital, because there's no tracking on those at all as we go forward. But very much looking forward to working with you on this. This is something very close to our heart. I want to go to our online. Can I ask Minister one question that you mentioned on innovation, which both Fayolle and you both talked about? From Egypt's perspective, Egypt is a very attractive place to invest, has been actually the last few years. What do you see in private capital and climate-related investment from your perspective?
Several opportunities. So green hydrogen was mentioned, and green hydrogen is seen as a huge potential. And in order to produce green hydrogen, then renewables come in, so solar and wind. And we've had earlier very good investments since 2014 with Binban and the work we do with all our development partners in that space. The other is innovation with respect to agriculture, because I think that is also where when you talk about adaptation tracking, one of the key items that comes up when we talk to the private sector, why aren't you coming in adaptation? They said we cannot account for how much reduction in emissions we're doing. And we have net zero commitments. So we also need to work on trying to track the outcomes of adaptation projects to encourage more private sector to come in and invest. So that might be, I don't know, maybe it's in your blog already, but if it's not, that's one finding that we had several roundtables during the World Economic Forum last May, and to try and see why don't we, if we take a look at the landscape of climate, adaptation gets the least And as you mentioned, private sector is not in that space by the size, and philanthropy comes in, but it's very small pockets. And if we want to get more private sector in there and have that initial grant component from a philanthropy, which is possible, they need to be able to track their contributions to net zero. One last thing, and being in the Water Institute, you all know this, but for the audience, that the $1 spent on adaptation projects, the impact is much more on the number of people that benefit. And if we're talking about women as a disproportionate part of population that's affected by climate change, adaptation investment is important because you will be able to mitigate that to a large extent. So when we come to Egypt, the country platform, NOAFI, Nexus of Water, Food and Energy, and NOAFI in Arabic, as I mentioned, means fulfilling promises. So when we say it's from pledges to implementation, we chose a word that reflects what the COP is about. We're very happy that EIB, among other partners, is part of the platform, and it's open to the private sector to come in and engage. But as I mentioned, we want to find innovative ways from our partnerships from before and other ongoing instruments, since this is a toolkit on innovative and blended and so forth, to be able to push forward. But the opportunities are there. Renewable is very important. Trying to export more gas to Europe requires that we substitute to more renewables faster than our initial plans. So this is in the store. And then green hydrogen, which is quite impressive as well. And water desalination, since we're here in water. So the same way we created a change in structural reforms with the feed-in tariff for the private sector in renewables in 2014, water desalination is coming as the next big set of or theme for private sector engagement. So we have opened up procurement for private sector companies in water desalination, and that is supposed to be the next big thing for us. And it's quite impressive for governments, because when water is a subsidized or a public good, the pricing of desalination becomes quite important, and the government will get the brunt of that. So this is a very important movement forward when it comes to types of projects related to climate.
Yeah, especially if you can get a market mechanism going in that area, given the scarcity of that particular resource. Fantastic. We want to go to our audience because we want to give a chance. Valerie, please tell us the question and who is directed to, or I will just direct it to whoever.
Thank you. So we talked a lot about innovation, and some of our auditors were wondering how the EIB notably determines how and which projects are innovative. And this question was directed to the Vice President Fayolle.
Do we assess innovation? Well, actually, it's. We have standards and we have eligibility criteria that allow us to do this. What I would say is, what I see is more and more projects that have an innovative content, but altogether not enough innovation projects. So I am not sure if the issue is an issue of structuring finance, of risk taken, of nature of the projects, but we need to do more. We need to do more because when you look at the objective, for example, of climate neutrality by 2050, that has been taken by Europe in particular, we know that we will not reach this target if there are not innovation in this decade that come, and then that are financed and then scaled up and developed to really contribute to the decarbonization. So, but all in all, what we finance is projects that are from very big research and development projects of very big corporates, for example, to very small projects that are in innovation with the European Commission, for example, EIC initiative, or with the breakthrough in energy venture capital that has been put in place with the Gates Foundation, where this is really small projects demonstration, early stage. So it is that from early stage to quite exactly.
But innovation for you're looking at innovative solutions, and you're then packaging that with innovative structures or financing structures.
And we are, I mean, we are an innovation bank, so we are an engineer bank, and I think there is no need to convince people that that we are very much looking forward to innovation.
Can I make
Please.
a comment? Just in terms of innovation, there's a youth day in COP in November 10th, and we put out a competition, a global competition called Climate Tech Run. It's for innovation related to adaptation or mitigation projects, and also digital arts. So the shortlist is going to be announced before COP, and they can come and pitch during Youth Day. So that would be also maybe an opportunity to try and encourage the startups and those who have ideas related to innovation adaptation. This is the small spectrum that on the other side,
This is very good.
the VP
Because
discussing.
we saw youth outside protesting last time, so it would be very good to have them inside and participating in the construction. Please, President.
Absolutely. Maybe we also need some innovation in politics. When we talk about innovation, development, climate, we always do it separately. We put these policies into 3 different boxes, but now we see it will work only together. I'll give you the example of mass production of green hydrogen. This will work in particular with the help of our African neighbors. And that means that we must bring top technology to Africa, sometimes technologies which do not exist yet. But we should have the confidence that we are able to further develop our technology so that in a few years, we will be able to exploit them fully in order to produce not only green, but also affordable green hydrogen. So let's be a little bit more optimistic when we believe that we cannot achieve something. Nobody would have thought that we would have been able to develop a vaccine against COVID-19 within 6 months. Every pharmaceutical expert told us 6 years at least it worked. So let's trust our ingenuity a little bit more.
Perfect. That's a very good segue. Valerie, we might have maybe chance for 2 more quick questions.
So I'm grouping a number of questions here. What can MDBs do to accelerate the deployment of finance at scale in developing countries? And in particular, how can investments, for example, in mangroves or coastal restoration be accelerated, especially in countries with long and exposed coastlines where livelihoods and activities of MSMEs are at risk?
All right. It's not only Global South, but difficult to invest things.
Yeah, and it is. I mean, it is true that that this is very much needed. Let me give you one example of what we do, because it's also good to be concrete. We have launched, actually, President Werner was there in Bali at the time of the annual meetings of the IMF. So it was in 2019. 18 or 19, what we call the Clean Ocean Initiative, together with the French Development Agency, AFD, and the German Development Agency, KfW. And together, the 3 of us, we decided to commit 2 billion euros to what we said was take plastic out of the ocean. The initiative is basically that if we don't do anything, in 2050, there will be more plastic than fishes in the ocean. And that we need for that to limit also the amount of micro-polluting plastics that are way too many in the ocean, and for that, to take that out from the river, because scientists tell you that when it comes to the ocean, it's too late. The initiative was actually very much related to water and wastewater. And it worked extremely well, especially in Africa, especially on coastal areas, for example, in Cotonou, where part of the city was underwater part of the year. And we've done so well, actually, that almost all the money that was dedicated has been used. And what we have decided last year is to extend and enhance the project, we have added two bilateral institutions, GDP and ECO, so GDP from Italy and ECO from Spain. We've added EBRD and committed together to 4 more billions by 25. So this is the kind of things where I hope that the person who asked the question is going to be able to see impact concretely.
Yeah,
exactly.
at scale. Did you want to add anything to this?
No, I don't.
Valerie, last question. It has to be for the minister.
Last few questions on adaptation. So many are wondering where the financing for adaptation will come from, and how the institutions are thinking about the financiability of such projects when the return is really about avoidance of climate costs. Do we need a new global initiative to get this flowing, or a new asset class of adaptation bonds? Or could we think, how do you deal with the granularity of adaptation investments and the fact that many don't generate cash flow?
Well, I think the question also had many answers because each of the suggested questions is actually a way to meet it. But we discussed that a bit. If we take a look at MDBs, they're supposed to be a 50-50 when it comes to mitigation and adaptation allocation with respect to climate finance. And again, accounting, let's look at the report and see what it says about finance for adaptation. But in all cases, it's not as much as is required. So that's one issue. We mentioned that private sector doesn't see how they can account for the emissions, and that's going to be a very important, I think, catalyst if we want private money to come into adaptation projects. The third point is innovation and adaptation, and that's why if we're doing, particularly for the distressed countries, debt swaps related to nature or related to adaptation projects, that is one way of trying to answer the question. But to do the scale and the leverage, it has to include MDP participation, maybe philanthropy, so that we create a bundling, if we put it in investment banking sort of language, and that can happen only if the different pockets of money come together in a meaningful way. We do have an adaptation initiative during COP, and it is called FAST. So that is going to be revealed we have an adaptation day. So this is also going to be an important initiative. We have one on water, which is AWARE. So be aware of how fast we will bring the COP together. So I think again, just to conclude on COP, there's plenty that has happened over the past few months, despite the tough situation. There's been a lot of engagement with the different stakeholders. I think that there's more focus on exactly what the issues are. So there's agreement on the issues, and I think everyone really in their space is working as hard as possible as hard as given the circumstance, to try and get something meaningful out of this. And looking forward to welcoming everyone online and here to COP27.
I hope we're all looking forward to it. I hope you give us a little cheat sheet with all the acronyms.
Just one thing I would like to add. I think sometimes it's not needed to oppose adaptation and mitigation, because quite often they go together. And let me give you one example that we have financed. In Vanuatu, we have financed a wind farm. In Vanuatu, you have wind. But the problem is that you have also, I don't know how they call that, but hurricanes that come much more often than before. This is adaptation. The wind turbines are mitigation. The way to combine the two is to finance a project where, when the cyclone came, you can put the turbines down and you put them back up when the cyclone has passed. And this is the right combination of dealing with mitigation and adaptation at the same time. And I think that's what also we try to do at the bank, and to look, when we look at projects, including in Europe, where there are more floodings than before, when there are more forest fires than before, etc. Should we include a way of events that were century like for centuries are now probably going to come back every 5 to 10 years. Now that the minister has made some teasing, can I just make a short teasing? There is next week in Abidjan an important meeting on the way to Sharm el-Sheikh of not only MDBs, MDBs will be there, we are going to organize that, President Fayolle will be there. Actually, the minister, al-Mashat, makes us the pleasure to come to Abidjan. Not only the MDBs, but all the public development banks.
Oh, fantastic.
And the issue is to look at climate strategy and how we can be better. And actually, one of the objectives we have is also to try to put all these institutions, and there are 600 or 700 of them, together to discuss, share experiences. You know, this is also how we can progress. So next week in Abidjan.
That is a fantastic, and recently actually, Remy was here talking about this group of people and the importance of this national banks, like BNDES, for example, or others, in doing the due diligence of these projects to have a pipeline of project investment. So highly, very excited about what you're doing that on the way to, I think we are out of time. It's impossible to summarize this, but I just I want to make a few points from this discussion. First of all, it's a critical discussion, and this is not the only time we're going to hear it. How do we finance this transition? But this is exactly the kind of discussion we need. I very much agree with the sentiment. I think President Hoyer, you said, and Ambroise, you said, is I think we have commitments. I know it's not 1.5 degree, but we actually have significant commitment from companies, from businesses, from cities, and of course, nation states. Now the question is, how do we convert it to outcomes, to solutions? And I love that the Egypt COP is an implementation COP, right? Because we will have COP next year, which is about the stock take. So we will have a chance to review where we are. Few things I want to underline. President Hoyer, you start talking about that not only this does not discuss, it needs to happen. And it needs to have everyone on board, not just MDBs, but all the different finalists who are working together, innovative solution. Absolutely, I hope everyone takes that message, because innovation, not only in solutions, Ambroise, but actually in structuring, de-risking, getting private capital there is exactly what we would need. Minister, you talked about being practical. I couldn't underline it more. The fact that you focused on water, which is a real issue for majority of population, actually, the 3.3 billion people in the world who are impacted by climate are actually impacted with various levels of water issues. Where there's too much water, too little water, or typhoon, it is very connected to what the water cycle is. So we want to support you and wish you real luck in getting the momentum going in practical solutions in food systems and water security issues and adaptation issues. And finally, I think I heard for people like us, a real call to action to get the science of measuring adaptation better, easier, so it's accountable, and so people in private sector invest. Please join me. You can't do it virtually. I hope you join me in thanking our fantastic panel here. I really want to thank you for having the opportunity to co-host with you and Minister. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.